Hello, this video is on Chapter 28, the female reproductive system, and we're going to talk about the uterine cycle or the menstrual cycle, and this cycle corresponds and correlates with the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle was 28 days long. Day 1 of the ovarian cycle began when those primordial follicles started to develop. And then by day 14, the secondary oocyte ovulated into the pelvic cavity. And then by day 28, the Corpus Luteum degenerated into the Corpus Albicans if the secondary oocyte was not fertilized. The estrogens and progestins that are secreted from the follicle cells and the corpus luteum in the ovary have a lot to do with what goes on in the uterus. So before we get started on the uterine cycle, let's just go back and take a look at the ovarian cycle again and look at the hormones. So first of all, we have FSH. FSH is released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. FSH then causes the primordial follicles to start developing into primary follicles. The follicle cells, called the granulosa cells, along with the cells of the stroma of the ovary called thecal cells, they start to produce estrogen. As the follicle gets bigger and becomes a secondary follicle and then a tertiary follicle, the levels of estrogen increase because the number of cells are increasing that produce estrogen. When the luteinizing hormone, or LH, gets released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary, it will initiate meiosis I to complete, and the primary oocyte will then become a secondary oocyte. As the levels of LH increase higher and LH becomes very high, that will trigger the ovulation of the secondary oocyte from the ovary. The secondary oocyte gets released into the pelvic cavity, but there are still some of the follicle cells that remain in the ovary. Those follicle cells then will produce a structure called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is an endocrine structure that releases the hormone progesterone. It also continues to release small amounts of the hormone estrogen. If fertilization occurs, the corpus luteum will stay intact and will continue producing progesterone and estrogen until the placenta is formed. But if fertilization does not occur, then the corpus luteum will degenerate into a scar tissue that's called the corpus albicans. When the corpus albicans is formed, then estrogen levels and progesterone levels will plummet because the corpus albicans does not have the ability to secrete those hormones. The corpus luteum begins to form on day 15, the day after ovulation occurs. The corpus luteum will stay intact until around day 26, and if the secondary oocyte is not fertilized, then the corpus luteum will degenerate into the corpus albicans around day 26. On day 28, the ovarian cycle ends, and the very next day will be day 1 when a new ovarian cycle will begin. Now you know where estrogen and progesterone comes from, and now we're going to talk about how estrogen and progesterone controls the uterine cycle. The typical uterine cycle is a 28-day cycle, just like the ovarian cycle. 28 days is a typical uterine cycle, but it can vary from female to female. The cycle begins on day 1 with the onset of menstruation. Menstruation is also called menses. It's the destruction of the functional layer of the endometrium. During the first phase, called menses, the functional layer of the endometrium will be destroyed, and blood and tissues will be eliminated from the body of the female through the vaginal canal. In layman's terms, this is usually called a female's period. The functional layer of the uterus consists of glands and blood vessels and tissues, and this is what gets sloughed off or shed during the menstrual phase. There is another layer in the uterus called the basal layer, and the basal layer survives menstruation, and it won't be shed during the menstrual phase. The menstrual phase can last anywhere from 1 to 7 days. This means the female will bleed for 1 day up to 7 days. This is usually pretty consistent for the female. She'll bleed the same number of days each month, usually, but any of that range is normal. Bleeding for 1 day is normal, if that's what she always does. Bleeding for 7 days is normal, if that's what she always does. The menstrual phase is triggered by the plummeting of estrogens and progesterone. Remember, that occurred as the corpus luteum was degenerated into the corpus albicans, and estrogen levels and progesterone levels plummeted, and then that's going to trigger the menstrual phase to begin. Progesterone was the hormone that was keeping that functional layer intact in the uterine cycle. So as soon as progesterone levels plummet, then the functional layer of the endometrium can no longer be sustained and it will shed. The next phase of the menstrual cycle or the uterine cycle is called the proliferative phase. During the proliferative phase, the functional layer is restored in the endometrium. Glands are produced, blood is supplied to the area, and the cells of the tissue proliferate and multiply. The endometrial layer gets thicker. This phase corresponds to the follicular phase of the ovary. Remember that during the follicular phase of the ovary, the follicle cells are developing, and as they develop, they start to secrete estrogens. So it's estrogen that makes the functional layer of the uterus thicker. The proliferative phase is going to continue until ovulation, which is day 14. At day 14, ovulation occurs in the ovary, and then the follicle cells become the corpus luteum, and at that time estrogen levels fall. So the proliferative phase ends and the endometrium doesn't get any thicker. As the proliferative phase ends on day 14, the next phase begins. The next phase is called the secretory phase. During the secretory phase, the endometrial glands enlarge and they start secreting at a faster rate, and the arteries of the uterine walls start to elongate. And these changes are stimulated by the progestins from the corpus luteum. So the main progestin is the progesterone. It's also stimulated by the estrogen that's released from the corpus luteum because there is still a small amount of estrogen being released from the corpus luteum. The secretory phase begins at the time of ovulation, and it will persist as long as the corpus luteum remains intact and is secreting progesterone and estrogen. The activities of this secretory phase are going to peak at about 12 days after ovulation, which is day 26. If fertilization hasn't occurred, then the corpus luteum degenerates to the corpus albicans, and progesterone and estrogen levels decline. As those two hormones decline, then the glandular activity in that functional layer declines, and then the uterine cycle ends at day 28, and then a new cycle will begin the next day on day 1 with menses. The whole secretory phase lasts about 14 days. Let's go over the hormones and the female reproductive cycle. There are circulating hormones from the pituitary glands and the gonads that control the female reproductive cycle. We've already seen these. The coordination between the ovarian and the uterine cycles is required for normal fertility for the female. We talked about FSH and LH, which are the follicle-stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. And these hormones are controlled by a secretion from the hypothalamus that's called the gonadotropic releasing hormone. There are variations in the amount and the frequency of gonadotropic releasing hormone release, and this is essential to the release of FSH and LH from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. The hypothalamus secretes gonadotropic releasing hormone in pulses, and this will trigger the release of FSH and LH from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. FSH then initiates the development of follicles, and when the follicles are developed, then that will activate the follicles and the interstitial cells of the ovary to produce estrogens. Estrogen levels are going to increase as the follicle cells increase in numbers. Early in the follicle phase of the ovarian cycle, the estrogen levels are low. When the estrogen levels are low, the pulse frequency of the release of gonadotropic releasing hormone will be lower, around 16 to 24 pulses per day. At this frequency, FSH is the dominant hormone released by the anterior pituitary. So FSH is stimulated by this lower pulse frequency. The estrogen released by the developing follicles also inhibits luteinizing hormone, so the only hormone that's really being released is the follicle-stimulating hormone in this early phase, and luteinizing hormone is being inhibited. As the primary follicle becomes a secondary follicle and the follicle cells start to multiply, the granulosa cells of the ovary will start secreting a hormone called inhibin. Inhibin will inhibit the release of FSH. The FSH levels then will start to decline towards the end of the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. Also towards the end of the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, the tertiary follicles are forming and estrogen concentration levels are going to rise very sharply. As estrogen levels start to peak, this is going to result in a higher pulse frequency of the gonadotropic releasing hormone in the hypothalamus. The pulse frequency will increase to about 36 pulses per day. The increase in the pulse rate of the gonadotropic releasing hormone will stimulate luteinizing hormone to be produced and to be secreted. So at about day 10, the lower level of estrogen changes to a higher level of estrogen, and luteinizing hormone then changes from being inhibited to now being stimulated to be produced and released. At about day 14, the estrogen levels will peak, and that will cause a massive release of the luteinizing hormone. When luteinizing hormone is released in this massive amount, the completion of meiosis I by the primary oocyte will occur, as well as the rupture of the follicle wall leading to ovulation. The high levels of luteinizing hormone will also promote the formation of the corpus luteum, and subsequently then will also promote the secretion of progesterone from the corpus luteum. As the progesterone levels rise and the estrogen levels fall, gonadotropic releasing hormone pulse frequency declines as well. Progesterone levels remain high for the next week, and the corpus luteum degenerates unless a pregnancy occurs. About 12 days after ovulation, the corpus luteum becomes non-functional and degenerates into the corpus albicans. At this time, estrogen and progesterone levels decline. The gonadotropic releasing hormone frequency starts to increase as estrogen levels decline, and this stimulates FSH secretion from the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and the ovarian cycle begins again. All right, I want to go over just a couple more things. I'm going to talk about the autonomic nervous system and how it influences the male and female sexual function. So during sexual arousal in males, or if they have erotic thoughts, or if there's any type of sensory stimulation, or both, it could lead to parasympathetic activity that will produce an erection. An erection occurs as the erectile tissue in the penis becomes engorged with blood. As the male becomes sexually aroused, the parasympathetic nervous system is stimulated, and this dilates the blood vessels to the erectile tissue. As the erectile tissue becomes engorged with blood, an erection occurs. Sexual arousal also leads to emission and ejaculation. Ejaculation is the release of the sperm and the semen from the male reproductive system. This ejaculation occurs in two phases. In the first phase, called emission, sperm are moved from the testes and the epididymis, where the sperm are stored, to the beginning of the urethra. The urethra is a hollow tube running through the penis, and this hollow tube transports either sperm or urine. In emission, the tube is transporting sperm and semen to the beginning of the urethra. In the second stage of ejaculation, which is called ejaculation proper, the semen's then moved through the urethra and is expelled from the body. While the parasympathetic nervous system is stimulated for sexual arousal to occur, the sympathetic nervous system will be stimulated in order for ejaculation to occur. The term orgasm stands for intensely pleasurable sensations that accompany ejaculation. There's another term called detumescence. This is the subsiding of an erection due to the decrease in blood from the erectile tissue. The term impotence refers to an inability to achieve or maintain an erection. The events of female sexual function resemble those of male sexual function, with the parasympathetic nervous system causing arousal and skeletal muscle contractions associated with orgasm. The female orgasms accompanied by peristaltic contractions of the uterus and the vaginal walls and contractions of the bulbospongiosus and ischiocavernosus muscles. The term infertility refers to the inability to conceive or carry a pregnancy to term after 1 year of unprotected intercourse. Now, I just want to talk about some changes that occur throughout the lifespan. So, at weeks 5 to 6 of development of the embryo is said to be sexually indifferent, so neither male nor female. This is because both the gonads and other internal and external reproductive structures are similar in both of the sexes. It's the presence of testosterone that stimulates the differentiation and the development of the male reproductive structures. Without testosterone, the sexually indifferent embryo will develop female reproductive structures. In the male, the descent of the testes through the inguinal canals begins during the 7th month of fetal development. If the testes don't descend through the inguinal ligament to the scrotum, that means that they are still in the abdominal or pelvic cavity, then the male will be infertile. During ages 50 to 60 in the male, circulating testosterone levels decrease and FSH and LH levels also decrease. We call this the male climacteric. In a female, menopause occurs at ages 45 to 55. This is the time that ovulation and menstruation stop. Perimenopause occurs in a female as well. This is when the female has irregular ovarian and uterine cycles that are preceding menopause. This is due to a shortage of the primordial follicles. As the available follicles start to decrease, estrogen levels also decline, and this may or may not trigger ovulation. So she might not ovulate every month during perimenopause. Also during perimenopause, the production of gonadotropic releasing hormone, FSH, and LH all rise, but the circulating concentrations of estrogen and progesterone decrease due to the shortage of follicles. Premature menopause is defined as the depletion of primordial follicles occurring before the age of 40. This ends our second video on the female reproductive tract. See you next time.